I think what happened with the UK is what happened with a lot of other countries. We actually ended up with a cycle that was not as benign as we thought. However, it was still a strong economy, and we had 10 years of pretty much uninterrupted prosperity. Now, we were affected, and look, everybody's affected when the global financial crisis occurred. I think what I would say, and this is where I began this conversation about the fundamental savings review, which I wanted to implement after 2005, I think that was the time we should probably have taken a tougher fiscal position than we did.
Why didn't you get a grip of it back in 2005 then? When you were starting to worry that we were spending too much?
I mean, this wasn't about predicting the financial crisis, incidentally, because I didn't. But it was about thinking we'd reached the limit of public spending, and we now had to drive value through our public services. And therefore, I wanted to, and indeed we did create this mechanism called the Fundamental Savings Review. I think this was probably
But you couldn't make it happen, that's
No,
the question.
well, this is where the disagreement between myself and Gordon, I think, started to spill over into macroeconomic policy as well.
You failed to win the argument about spending with Gordon Brown in 2005, 2006, and you then went. What are your reflections now on the Brown government?
I think in the programme to stabilise the banks, I think this was Gordon at his very best. I think he acted quickly, he acted perceptively, and in a sense he led the world in that. And he will rightly, in my view, get much credit for that in history. The problem after then, not just in our country but in others, is that people kind of bought this idea that what we required was a traditional Keynesian stimulus package, that the state was back in fashion, and actually, I think it's a lot more complicated than that.
So we were actually spending too much at that point, in your view?
Well, I would have taken a somewhat different way out of the economic crisis. And I think that in the end, the right way to deal with this is to recognize that though the state has to come in to stabilize the economy, it's not the state or government that is going to bring us back to high levels of growth. And even with the financial sector, I am a big advocate of global supervision, tracking these new financial instruments. I'm not a fan of regulation that is too heavy, that's going to flatten our financial system. I think that would be a big mistake, and we'll end up in a situation where the banks, having been, as it were, too adventurous, then become too risk adverse.
A lot of people would say, well, it's absolutely clear. Your vision is actually of a small c conservative politician, and your journey has been from somebody who thought he was a Labour politician to somebody who's realised actually he's not.
And I'm not a conservative, I'm a progressive. And I mean, I think some of politics is right versus left, and some of it's right versus wrong. Okay? Now, I actually think there are elements. I mean, I'm a progressive politician. We introduced the minimum wage, we introduced equality, for example, for gay people, we did a massive program of devolution, restoring power to the people. We put a huge amount in for the poorest pensioners, for the poorest families. You go to any inner city estate near here and you will see the investment.
I'm just listening to this, and I think David Cameron would tick every single one of these boxes.
Yeah, but why should we then say we're like him rather than he's trying to get on our territory?
I just feel we used to joke about him being the heir to Blair. He said it, then regretted it. Maybe, actually, if you look at the policies, the detailed policies, that's exactly what he is.
I'm not sufficiently abreast of their detailed policies to better comment on that. The one thing I do say is this: progressive politicians today should get used to new politics. You look at the emerging market economies who are now starting to develop their middle class, and therefore they're having to develop their welfare and public services. They're going for a partnership between the individual and government, and they're going for public services that are far more a mixture of private and public and far more individual choice and so on. This is the way of the world. You get yourself on the wrong side of that argument, you're just on the wrong side of history.
And is your old party about to get on the wrong side of that argument in its leadership?
Well, I hope not. And
who would you back?
Not.
Go on.
I'm not going to go.
It's fairly obvious who you back.
Well,
for some reason you haven't said it.
I know, and it may be fairly obvious, but and I'm not saying it isn't. But I mean, I still have a huge loyalty, admiration, and actually love for the Labour Party, and I want to see it do well. And whoever is elected leader, I will, even if it's Diane, right? Yes. They'll have my 100% support.
It's just that when you were creating New Labour and then had your disagreements with Gordon Brown, it often said it was like two brothers fighting. Well, now we do have two brothers fighting, one taking a more Blair position and one perhaps a more left position.
Look, all I can speak about is what I think, and incidentally, just to say about David, anybody who knows him knows he's very much his own man. I mean, I think that for me, the thing with the Labour Party is always be at the cutting edge of the future. And that means on public services and welfare, you cannot run them in 2010 as if you were still in 1950. And the question for the Labour Party is, do you buck the historical trend, which has always been you lose an election and then you go off and decide to lose a few more
and
before you come back to your
This is a
senses.
crossroads moment.
This is a very, very interesting period of politics because we live in an era of low predictability and anything could happen. If you'd said a few years back you'd have a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, I mean, you'd have been scratching your head at that one, certainly.
What do you make of them?
Too early to tell. But the one thing I'm absolutely sure of is that Labour's got to go right back in contention, because the most important thing for the Labour Party to realise is it can win the next election. You don't have to go with the historical trend. But the Tory party is the party with options at the moment, right? Because they can govern with the Lib Dems and succeed on that basis and then say, oh, well, we broadened out, or they can ditch them. So, they're the one with the options. And we've got to, if we are smart about it and we go right back into contention, then we'll give them a run for their money.
Let's talk a little bit about what this journey, what this period in power did to you. I quoted at the beginning this feeling that you had sort of halfway through, that you'd like to get out, still smiling, the country still smiling back, listened to, not loathed. It didn't happen. But what was the effect on you as a human being of all of this?
Look, I started as one sort of leader and ended as another. I don't think I've changed as a human being, incidentally, at all. But I started as a leader who wanted to please all of the people all of the time. We've been 18 years in opposition. It's not unnatural. You want to try and take the Labour Party back to power, and you start with that view. But as I went on, I realised you can't please all of the people all of the time. In fact, by the end of it, I was wondering whether I was pleasing any of them any of the time. But it was a sort of view I had that ultimately your job is to have the courage to do what you think is right, and the rest is up to them.
Yet out there you are loathed by many people, including many people who once sort of adored you. I mean,
get this in perspective. Yes, there will be people who do that, but as I do say, I did win 3 elections rather than lose them. And I would remind you, when I actually left office, we were, in fact, just about neck and neck with the Tories, actually. So, look, but for 3 years, people haven't heard my voice.
And I come back to why.
Because it was impossible, and it's very hard for me still. I mean, I don't want to cause trouble for David Cameron, actually, quite apart from not wanting to cause trouble. Because I know what it's like to do that job, and it's really difficult. And the last thing you need is someone who used to do the job, popping up. I mean, obviously, I'll go out and help the Labour Party and so on, but popping up and saying, oh, he's not doing this right, not doing that right. I know how difficult it is, and I have a sympathy and respect for anyone who's doing it.
And what about the specific legacy, the really bitter and toxic legacy of the Iraq War? All those people said, you shouldn't be interviewing, you should be taking him to the Hague to war crimes. That will never go away, will it? There will
always be people who feel like that, but they're not. The majority of people are far more sensible about issues like this. Sure, you'll get, the people who do the blogs and the whatever nowadays and will come on the protests. It's not the whole of people.
No, but it means that you have to live a semi-protected life. You can't go out there and wander the streets or do book signings or behave like an ordinary person.
That's the way it is, but it's the way it is in politics today. And
speaking of book signings in the book, at what point did you decide to hand the $4.5 million to the British Legion? And I mean, have you actually written them a cheque? What's happened?
All the money I get from the book, the advance, and
any royalties abroad?
And any royalties abroad, anywhere, anything I get, I will pass on to them.
Right.
Whatever I
get. But you had some money and you've given it to them.
Yeah, all the money I have, I will give to them.
Why?
Because I wanted, and I took this decision not to give it to the British Legion, but to give it to something connected with the armed forces before I'd even written a word. because I wanted to indicate my sense of respect and the honour in which I held those people that I regard as out on the front line of the biggest security threat we face in the world today.
So it's saying respect. It's not saying sorry.
No, it's to honour their commitment, because I believe what they're doing is valuable and worthwhile. I don't think their sacrifice or their commitment is wasted. I think, on the contrary, it's absolutely necessary for our security and the security of the world. But it's my way of showing that sense of honour to them. And I know some of them will not want it, and some people will shout about it, and I don't mind about that. It's not why I'm doing it, and I know why I'm doing it, so I don't.
You're a very rich man. I mean, you've got I think a property empire, I think is a fair phrase. How many, is it 8, 9 properties now?
I don't actually, and the reports of my wealth.
How many have you got, and how wealthy are you?
Look, first of all, let me just make one thing about this. I'm basically a public service person, right? I could have stayed at the bar if I'd wanted to make money. In my life now, I would have stayed on as being Prime Minister and be very happy. I would have taken the presidency of the European Union and be very happy.
You would have taken that had it been offered?
Of course, and I would have been delighted to do it and gone and done public service. And I may do a public service job again in the future. What motivates me and gets me up in the morning is not making money, and never has been. Now, it's correct. I want to look after my family, make sure they're okay, and I spend a lot of my time travelling the world, and I don't spend as much time with them as I would like. But in the end, the important thing for me is to build these charities, the interfaith charity, which is bringing different faiths of the world together and is very much connected with what I'm doing, and the Africa Governance Charity that we want to expand. They're multi-million-pound charities now, and I want to build them up even bigger in the future.
Given the bitterness after Iraq, the endless, wearisome rows inside New Labour. I mean, reading all these books about New Labour, not your one particularly, but some of the others, it's like an endless playground fight between different tribal groups having a go at each other.
It's not really that. I mean, the fact is, we achieved an enormous amount. I bet these disagreements were every bit as fierce in the governments of the past. But you probably were living in a different culture and a different world where people didn't explain them and talk about them and so on in the way they do today.
If you think of those governments of the past, if you think the two other prime ministers in terms of longevity since the war, or in terms of changing the country since the war that you would presumably want to be judged by, would be Clement Attlee and Margaret Thatcher. And you would have to say that they both changed Britain more radically than you were able to do.
Well, I think that's a judgment that we've made in history, but I don't want to, it's not a comparison I sort of make. I think that in some ways what we were trying...
Given your huge majorities, could you not have done more?
I think we did do an immense amount, and I think in time people will see that a little more clearly. And in a sense what we were trying to do was to modernise the concept of public services and the welfare state, which in a way the Attlee government introduced, but in a very monolithic and, in today's terms now, an old-fashioned way. And in respect of Mrs. Thatcher, we were trying to keep that liberalism and dynamism that I think was an important part of Britain's economic progress, but add to it a greater sense of us as a country where we were investing in the public realm, where we were treating people equally, where we were trying to enhance opportunity for those that didn't have it. And so, I think, each government lives in its own time and has to deal with its own challenges. But I think when we were running Britain, when I was Prime Minister, I think the country was strong and felt a fairer and better place than it had been. But that's that's what I think. Many may disagree.
Tony Blair, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.